What's up everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Persona Overview. In this series, we're going to be analyzing the party members from Persona 3, 4, and 5 in terms of their affinities, stats, skills, and any unique mechanics they may have in order to determine how they should be built and utilized in the party. Our focus will be on the newest version of each game, those being Persona 3 Reload, Persona 4 Golden, and Persona 5 Royal, but we will briefly go over the differences between the new and older versions for each party member. These videos will be gameplay focused, so there shouldn't be any spoilers if we can avoid it, but as always we recommend to watch your own discretion, and if you haven't played a Persona game before, we highly recommend giving the series a try. This episode will be focused on Aigis from Persona 3. We're going to start by clarifying that this episode will not be discussing Aigis' gameplay from the Answer or the episode Aigis DLC, since she essentially functions as a completely different party member, though that rendition of her may be discussed in a future video. Anyways, in the main story, Aigis is available to bring in a Tartarus for the first time on July 24th and starts at level 27. This puts her roughly in the middle of the recruitment order. She's not one of the starting party members, but she also doesn't join so late to the point where it's difficult to rearrange her team around her. Her persona is Palladian of the Chariot Arcana. This makes her the only female party member whose persona arcana doesn't max her social link arcana, since her social link arcana is the Aeon instead of the Chariot. The reason for this is because she didn't have a social link in the original version of Persona 3. As for Aigis' availability, she remains very consistently available for most of the game when she joins, except during December where she is unavailable for pretty much the entire month, from December 3rd to December 30th. However, there's no full moon deadlines during this time or anything else that really makes you have to go into Tartarus, so you can feel free to just wait out this time period if you don't want her to be underleveled. She doesn't miss any boss fights after she joins, which is definitely a nice boon for her viability.
Aigis' persona Palladion has a 50% resistance to pierce physical attacks while having a weakness to electric magical attacks. In the August full moon operation, the first one after she joins, the boss battle has a lot of pierce attacks, so Aigis is arguably a good choice to bring into that fight. However, in the September operation, the boss almost entirely specializes in electric attacks, so it might be a lot more questionable to bring her into that one. Aigis' personality revolves around her physical skills. She gets a significantly larger increase to her Theurgy meter upon using a physical skill than the other party members do, gaining 12%, while others gain around 2 to 5%. While the game doesn't explain this, she also gets a larger boost to her Theurgy charge from landing a critical hit compared to most of the other party members at 8%, while the others besides Junpei and Koromaru are all around 3 to 5%. This means that in order to build her Theurgy as quickly as possible, you should be focusing on using her physical skills as much as possible rather than her support skills. Aigis' first Theurgy is Orgia mode, which deals heavy pierce damage to all foes, ignoring resistances. It won't do as much damage to a single target as Theurgies listed as severe or massive, but it has the advantage of being able to hit multiple targets. After the attack part of the Theurgy, Aigis enters Orgium mode for 3 turns. She gets a 50% increase to her damage dealt, and a 50% reduction on damage taken. She is also immune to all ailments and can't be knocked down by crits or her weakness. She also gets another benefit of not consuming any HP or SP with her skills, but she acts autonomously during Orgia mode, so you won't be able to select what skills she uses, and she always prioritizes attacking as far as we can tell from testing. After the 3 turns are over, she overheats, giving her a unique status effect that leaves her unable to act for 2 turns. For that reason, it's best to use Orgia mode when you think the battle will end before you overheat.
Aigis has a decent stat spread across the board, though I wouldn't consider her to be one of the most optimally distributed party members. She starts with 277 HP and reaches 595 HP when she hits level 99. This puts her slightly lower than some of the other physical attacking specialists like Junpei and Akihiko in terms of HP, but still comfortably high among the party. As for SP, she starts at 149 SP and eventually reaches 333. This isn't going to be as high as the more magic-focused party members, but since Aigis only uses her SP for her support skills, the amount she has is usually enough. Moving on to strength, she starts at 21 and reaches 74. This puts her roughly in line with Akihiko, but behind the other physical attackers Junpei and Shinjiro by a decent amount. As for magic, she has a middling stat of only 15 that becomes 51 at level 99. It's fine for this to be mediocre since she only uses staff for healing, and even that becomes irrelevant when she unlocks full heals with the Arahan, rendering the stat useless. Moving on to her other 2 mediocre stats, her agility starts at 15 and ends at 53, which typically means she has the lowest agility of the party. This is unfortunate both for her evasion and accuracy, as well as going later in the turn order, though that can sometimes be a good thing. Her luck starts at 13 and ends at 49, which doesn't seem good either, though the thing is all the party members in this game have pretty low luck, so hers doesn't actually stand out much. It is a bit unfortunate for her crit rates though. Her standout stat is definitely her endurance, which is the highest of the party starting at 24 and ending at 88. Combined with her support and passive skills that we'll discuss soon, as well as her unique Orgia mode mechanic, Aigis does have a statistical niche as the best tank of the party.
In order to unlock Aigis' combat characteristic, you'll need to spend some nights doing activities with her. Her 2 activities are gardening and reading, but most likely you have to do some gardening first since her reading doesn't become available until September. She's typically available on Sundays for gardening, and gardening with her can yield healthy tomato EX, Maruto Kaja potato, nourishing Amrunyon, leafy soul spinach, golden tomato EX, or mirror herb depending on what sprout you plant. Once her reading becomes available, she's typically available on Wednesdays and you will gain +2 charm by spending time reading with her. Once you've done 3 sessions of either guarding or reading with her, you'll unlock her combat characteristic, Fizz Boost. This boosts damage of all her physical skills by 10%, regardless of whether they're Pierce or Strike. It's stacked with individual element boost skills like Pierce Boost and Pierce Amp without capping out, and it also affects Thurgies, which are both really important benefits. Once you've done 3 sessions of gardening and 3 sessions of reading, Fizz Boost will upgrade into Fizz Amp, increasing the boost to physical damage from 10% to 20%. The boost from Fizz Amp may not be as high as a percentage of some other combat characteristics like Buff Amp and Crit Amp, but it is extremely consistent. It doesn't require any special conditions, it just works on any physical skill, which is what Aigis wants to use anyways. Overall, this is definitely a very good combat characteristic, and you should prioritize obtaining it as soon as possible if you want to use Aigis on your team.
Aigis' offensive skill set consists of Pierce physical skills, both single target and multi-target, as well as multi-target strike skills as a secondary offensive element. She is one of only 2 party members in the main story who do not learn any offensive magic skills. When she joins, she starts with only 2 attacking skills, the first of which is Arrow Rain, an 85% accurate Pierce skill that hits up to 4 times. The other is Swift Strike, which is a strike skill that comes with slightly lower accuracy on only 80%, and only hits up to 2 times instead of 4, but in exchange each individual hit is roughly 50% stronger, which makes it less RNG dependent. At level 30, only 3 levels after she joins, she gets the very much appreciated Cruel Attack, a Pierce skill that deals a solid and consistent amount of damage in only 1 hit, taking the RNG out of the equation in exchange for a slightly lower damage ceiling, especially when factoring in the ability to crit multiple times on multi-hits. However, Cruel Attack does have a secondary effect that evens this out. It deals 50% more damage to down foes, which can make Aigis an excellent choice to shift to after another party member downs an enemy. She doesn't learn another offensive skill until level 43, where she gets Myriad Arrows. This is basically Arrow Rain on steroids, going up from 1 to 4 hits to 2 to 5 hits, 85% accuracy to 88%, and a sizable increase in base power per hit as well. This is a huge power spike for her, and has some of the best multi-target damage output out of any of your party members at this point in the game. She then learns Heat Wave at level 53, which is a nice upgrade to Swift Strike, but unless an enemy resists or nulls Pierce, you're probably better off using Myriad Arrows instead, especially if you have any gear that buffs Pierce. She gets Primal Force at level 64, which is by far her most important offensive skill, and another major power spike. It's one of the most consistently high damage single target physical skills in the game, and definitely the standout among Pierce skills. Her final offensive skill is Akasha Arts, which is an excellent multi-target strike skill. It's slightly less consistent than Heat Wave due to its multi-hit nature, but with 1 to 2 hits, 88% accuracy, and a higher crit rate, it's absolutely worth the trade-off, and it's overall the best strike skill she gets. Just judging by the skill itself, it's her strongest multi-target skill, but since Aigis typically uses Pierce boosting gear to buff Primal Force, it can often have a lower damage ceiling than Myriad Arrows, which does make it a little underwhelming in optimized builds. It's still at least very good as a coverage option though.
When Aigis is first unlocked, she already starts with 3 support skills. She has both Tarukaja and Rakukaja, which target only 1 ally and grant them a 40% buff to attack or defense respectively for 3 turns at the cost of 8 SP. She also gets Takunda, which spends 10 SP to remove all debuffs to attack, defense, or agility from the entire party. Her utility pool expands to level 33 pretty soon after she joins, at which she gets Diorama, which heals 1 ally by a moderate amount and costs 8 SP. At level 37, she gets Fast Heal, which is a decent passive skill that makes her recover from ailments in half the normal number of turns. Up to this point, her arsenal of support skills is okay, but not really anything too special. However, at level 40, she picks up Marukukaja, which buffs the whole party's defense by 40% for 3 turns in exchange for 24 SP, providing a big power spike to her utility. Next, she gets an Old Dizzy at level 46, another passive skill that helps her against ailments. This one makes her completely immune to Dizzy, which is okay, but is definitely a bit situational. At level 49, she gets arguably her most important utility skill, Marukukaja, which buffs the whole party's attack by 40% for 3 turns in exchange for 24 SP. She's the only party member, obviously not counting the protagonist, who gets the skill, so on top of it already being arguably the most useful buff, it's also very unique. Her last support skill is unlocked at level 56, where she gets Dia Rahan, allowing her to fully heal 1 ally by spending 20 SP. She does still learn passive skills though, starting with Insta Heal at level 60. It's a better version of Fast Heal, allowing her to recover from all ailments after only 1 turn. At level 68, she gets Enduring Soul, which lets her survive a fatal attack and automatically recover to full health once per battle. Finally, at level 76, she gets Resist Fizz, which grants Aigis a resistance to both Strike and Slash since she already resists or nulls Pierce.
Aigis is unfortunately the last party member to experience her second persona awakening in the main story. Palladian evolves into Athena, her ultimate persona, on December 30th when she returns from her period of unavailability, and is available to be used in Tartarus after that. This slightly changes her affinities. She keeps her weakness to electric attacks, but her resistance to Pierce is upgraded to a null, fully blocking all Pierce damage. Most importantly, the second awakening grants her access to her second Theurgy, Maximum Firepower. In contrast to her first Theurgy, Orgia mode, which is one of the most unique Theurgies in terms of gameplay, Maximum Firepower is a very basic but powerful Theurgy. Unlike Orgia mode, it's single target rather than multi-target, and it loses the effect of entering Orgia mode after using it, but in exchange it has a significantly higher power. It's essentially a Pierce equivalent of Junpei's Hacken's Blast and Shinjiro's Bleeding Fury. Aigis picking up this Theurgy is greatly appreciated, even if it's not unlocked until near the end of the game. Single target Theurgys are generally just going to be more useful than multi-target ones since they're much stronger and most of the difficult fights in the game are against only one enemy. Because of the way Theurgys work in this game, you can do insane amounts of burst damage with this Theurgy by granting her external support from charge and an attack buff as well as landing a crit, making her one of the party members who can even one-shot the Reaper when fully optimized. Though it does lack the ability for Aigis to enter Orgia mode after using it, that's not necessarily always a bad thing. The extra damage on the Theurgy itself usually makes up for losing the 3 turns of increased offense, and Orgia mode can backfire at times due to losing the ability to control Aigis and the overheat turns she suffers once it ends, so some players may even prefer it this way.
Aigis gets a lot of good skills, but when deciding what to put on her final build, the no-brainer is definitely Primal Force. It's her strongest attacking skill, so it's completely irreplaceable. Akasha Arts is also almost always worthwhile to keep as well to avoid being walled out by enemies that null pierce. It's also possibly her best multi-target skill, but if you have any pierce damage boosting gear, which we recommend, you should probably keep Myriad Arrows in your build since it will most likely outdamage Akasha Arts. Moving on to her sports skills, Marutu Urkaja is the most important one to keep since, like we mentioned before, she's the only party member who gets it. Looking at her passive skills, Enduring Soul is a lock for the final build. It allows her to play more risky and use her physical skills at even lower HP since she has a safety net, which is really useful even if it never activates, and if it does activate, that can be so clutch for maintaining momentum in difficult fights. Resist Fizz definitely earns its place as well. Getting 2 very useful resistances in exchange for only 1 skill slot is such good value that it's impossible to argue against. Insta-heal is also a really good passive that makes ailments almost a non-issue, which is very useful for certain enemies that rely on ailment spam. We would always recommend this to go on your final build unless you're planning on using one of our gear options that nulls all ailments, which renders instant heal irrelevant. As for this final slot, the best options are Marukukaja, Dia Rahan, or Dakunda. Marukukaja is probably the most useful utility out of these 3 and is generally the one we'd recommend, though stacking multiple buff skills on the same party member can be a little inefficient compared to splitting them around the party, so the other options also make sense. Out of the other 2, we personally think Dakunda is a bit more useful since healing items are easier to come by than Dakunda gems, but if you value healing a lot and don't feel like stacking up on healing items, then Dia Rahan is a perfectly good choice for the last skill slot.
Aigis gets access to a variety of useful gear throughout the game to improve her combat capabilities. Starting with her weapons, Aigis uses guns as her weapon type, which deal pierce damage. She doesn't have too many standout guns into the late game, where she has 2 excellent options. The antimatter cannon has a very high attack stat at 345, but most importantly, it grants Aigis Pierce Boost to boost the damage of her pierce attacks by 25%. The other good option is the Metatronius, which has an even higher attack at 450, and grants plus 5 to all her stats, as well as the effect of the skill Arms Master, having the HP cost of all physical skills. The Metatronius is arguably the better all-around weapon, but it's much harder to obtain and less effective than the Antimatter Cannon in terms of pure damage output, so I would personally go with the Antimatter Cannon. As for armor, Aigis can't use the typical female of armor options. She has her own unique armor type. The one with the highest defense is the Soul of Athena with 400 defense, also coming with the useful effect of nulling all ailments. As good as this is, personally I think Aigis is the party member that needs this the least due to her access to insta-heal and her immunity to ailments in Orgia mode, and the Soul of Athena is also the hardest armor to obtain for her. Speaking of Orgia mode, the Papillon method, which grants 360 defense and 1 additional Orgia mode turn, isn't a bad option for Orgia mode focused builds. However, I find myself using maximum firepower much more often than Orgia mode once available, so my personal favorite armor for her is the Ergo Compound, which provides 300 defense and a medium reduction to electric damage, which is her weakness. Moving on to footwear, Aigis once again has her own unique category. This time I do think that the Swan Legs, despite being the hardest to obtain, are her best option. They grant a high evasion boost to all magic alongside providing the evasion stat of all her footwear options at 125. The Aigis Legs V0 are easier to obtain and still very good, granting 96 evasion and a much appreciated plus 3 boost to strength. As a third option, Kugelbein allows her to recover from overheating faster, which can be a great pairing with the Papillon method in Orgia mode builds. Finally, for her accessory recommendation, I personally think the best one by far is the Vijaya Bracers, which grant Pierce Amp, boosting her Pierce damage by 50% and can stack with Pierce Boost. This is just such a huge consistent boost to damage that it's hard to recommend anything else, but there are some other good options. The Lightning Gloves grant No Elect, which turns her weakness into an immunity. The Omega Drive grants Apt Pupil, which doubles her crit rate. The Rudra Ring grants Arms Master, which can be very nice if you're not using Metatronius. Finally, the Space Badge isn't a bad option to keep her HP up while using physical skills, though I do think the Rudra Ring mostly outclasses it if that's what you're trying to do. To summarize, my personal favorite setup is the Antimatter Cannon, Ergo Compound, Swan Legs, and Vijaya Bracers, but there's a lot of gear that can work for her.
Since Persona 3 Reload is a game where physical attacks are very strong, Aigis had a lot of things going for her. Looking at her statistically, she has solid strength which keeps her damage output relevant throughout the game, especially when paired with her combat characteristic, which is definitely one of the best. At only 20% even in its upgraded form, it's not the highest percent boost ever, but when you consider that it just applies the damage buff on all physical attacks with no special requirements, it becomes obvious how useful it is. It helps that her main physical skill in the endgame is Primal Force, which is a very strong and reliable attack with a solid crit rate. There are other great physical attackers in this game, but one unique thing that Aigis has going for her over the rest of them is that she's the only party member with both a single target and multi-target physical theurgy, making her flexible into boss fights or just regular shadow encounters. However, Aigis isn't just an attacker, she has some really great support skills as well. She has access to single target healing, cleansing debuffs with Takunda, and most importantly the party buffs Maruto Urkaja and Maru Kakaja for attack and defense respectively. These are some of the most important buff skills in the game, and notably she's the only party member, obviously not counting the protagonist, with access to Maru Kakaja specifically, which gives her a useful supporting niche. I mentioned her strength, but her standout stat is definitely her endurance. When you factor in the great defensive passive skills she gets like Enduring Soul, Insta-Heal, and Resist Fizz, as well as her solid HP pool and the defensive benefits of Orgia mode, it becomes apparent just how tanky she really is. Tankiness is always useful, but it's especially nice on her since she only has physical attacks and that means she takes a lot of self-damage. Taking less damage from enemies means she doesn't need to heal as often and can afford to spam her physical skills more often, even when she's at low HP, especially due to insurance from Enduring Soul. Generally, Aigis' main strength is consistency. Crit Amp and Bloody Charge might give Junpei or Shinjiro a bit higher burst damage potential than she does, but Aigis puts out very consistent physical DPS throughout her longer sustained fights due to her tankiness and the buff from Fizz Amp.
Though Aigis is a very strong party member, she does have some weaknesses that will make you have to carefully consider her slot in the party. As we mentioned before, she's one of only 2 party members with no magic damage at all, so she can find herself completely walled out by enemies that resist or block physical skills, as well as enemies who use Tetrakarn to set up physical barriers. This is a bit easier to play around a reload because of her theurgies, which can bypass all of these, but it will still be an issue for certain fights. Additionally, Aigis is the party member who struggles the most with accuracy throughout the game. This is due to a combination of several factors, one of those being her low agility, but the main reason is because a lot of her physical skills are either multi-hit, multi-target, or both, which are generally less accurate than single-hit, single-target skills. This issue mostly goes away in the late game once she gets Primal Force, but is still relevant for a large portion of the game. Speaking of her low agility, this is a bit anti-synergistic with her support skills, especially Maru Kakaja, since you ideally want to use this before her teammates' turns to get the most value out of it. That's not a super big deal, and for her attacking role rather than a support role, it's arguably better for her to go later in the turn order after her teammates have used certain buff or debuff skills. The last weakness is that, like we mentioned, she takes the longest to get her second theurgy out of any of the party members. Her first theurgy is still good, but since she lacks a severe damage theurgy for most of the game and also doesn't get something like Crit Amp or Bloody Charge, Junpei and Shinjiro are usually ahead of her in terms of pure single target burst damage for most of the game, and have slightly higher damage ceilings overall. Orgia mode is still a very good theurgy, but it does have its downsides and can be punishing if used incorrectly, so you have to be smart about using it.
Aigis can fit well into most party compositions, but there are a few party members who she synergizes particularly well with. By far the best party member to pair Aigis with is Koromaru. The main reason for this is his Power Howling theurgy, which he has access to immediately once he's unlocked, granting the charge effect to the full party. This pairs excellently with all of her physical skills, but especially with her physical theurgies. The combination of Power Howling and maximum firepower leads to insane single target damage output, especially when bolstered by Koromaru's support skills like Revolution to boost crit rate and Debilitate to lower enemy stats. On the topic of his support skills, Koromaru also gets Masu Kakaja, which is the only party buff skill that Aigis doesn't get herself, so this pairing really covers all the bases. Another great pairing is Akihiko. He works very well in the physical focus comp alongside Aigis and Koromaru. Due to his theurgy charge condition and his combat characteristic both revolving around being buffed, Aigis is a great pairing with him because of her access to Maru Kakaja, and especially her unique access to Maruto Urkaja, and just like Koromaru, Akihiko also gets Masu Kakaja to complete the trio of buffs. He's also one of the best magic damage dealers, which can help make up for the fact that Aigis has complete lack of magic damage. Personally, we think the best way to run Aigis is alongside both Akihiko and Koromaru and forego a dedicated healer, since healing items are so abundant in this game anyways. However, having a healer with her isn't bad at all since she burns through so much HP with all of her physical skills. Out of the 2 main healer options, we would recommend Ken since Aigis is a bit anti-synergistic with Yukari. Aigis doesn't have any magic damage to take advantage of Yukari's Tranquility theurgy. Also, Aigis' access to fast heal and insta-heal as well as her full immunity to ailments in Orgia mode means that she doesn't benefit as much from Yukari's status curing as other party members. Meanwhile, Ken's Divine Intervention theurgy provides a really nice safety net to allow Aigis to spam her physical skills. Still, Yukari is better at strictly healing than Ken, so it's not like it's a bad pairing or anything. Like I said, you can make Aigis work in a wide variety of compositions.
Aigis is one of the most changed characters from older versions of Persona 3 in a reload. Her support role has been slightly nerfed, with one difference being that in a reload she loses access to Sukakaja and Masu Kakaja. That meant that she previously had access to all 3 party buff skills in her kit, which was definitely insane, though losing the agility buff isn't too big of a deal as it's probably the least consistently useful of 3 buffs. She also previously had Sama Rekarm as another utility option but lost in a reload. This is probably even less of a significant change since it's very easily replaceable with items. As for her offensive skills, the main difference is that in the older versions of Persona 3, she learned no Pierce skills, which is very strange because in terms of her affinities and her weapon, she has always been associated with Pierce. Instead of Arrow Rain, Cruel Attack, Myriad Arrows, and Primal Force, Aigis instead learned Kill Rush, Fatal End, and God's Hand. Those skills weren't bad by any means, but she definitely has a more clear elemental identity in Reload. A lesser known fact is that in the older versions, Aigis had a hidden immunity to the poison status effect. Orgia mode also works differently in the older versions. Since there were no Theurgies, Orgia mode was not activated through a Theurgy, but instead through the tactics menu. This made it an arguably more integral part of her kit since it wasn't tied to a meter, especially in the original Persona 3 Infest, because unlike in Portable and Reload, there was no option to manually control allies, so there's even less of a downside to using Orgia mode. However, Portable and Reload get the additional benefit of Aigis' skills in Orgia mode not consuming any HP or SP, which is great. In all the older versions, it also cleansed Aigis of any ailments when activated, while the current version of Reload actually can't be used while she has an ailment, like all other Theurgies. Though in Reload she gets useful defensive passive skills like Fast Heal, Insta Heal, Enduring Soul, and Resist Fizz that she previously didn't get, which definitely make up for this in the lost poison immunity. It's debatable which version of Orgia mode is the overall best since they all have their advantages and disadvantages. Her stat spread is also a little different in the older versions, with the main difference being that her strength was much more even with her magic compared to Reload. When you also consider the introduction of her combat characteristic, Reload Aigis is definitely more damage oriented. Overall, Aigis is still a strong and tanky physical attacker with useful support capabilities regardless of which version of Persona 3 you're playing, and you can't really go wrong with using her. That's about all we have to say about Aigis. If you enjoyed the video or have any thoughts of your own, please leave a like and make sure to comment. I also recommend checking the description if you're not already subscribed to both of our channels. Stay tuned for the next episode of Persona Overview next week on JCross' channel, where we will be moving on to the next party member, Akihiko Sanada from Persona 3. And for those of you coming from our Three Houses series, stay tuned for the first episode of Unit Overview, also on JCross' channel in the next few days. Thanks for watching.
Taking no prisoners.